She was walking home from summer school in a blue and white dress, and she never made it through the front door. For 46 years, a police department kept her photograph on the wall. Not in a file, not in a drawer. On the wall, where every detective who walked past it would remember her name. Because somewhere out there, walking free, going to work, raising a family maybe, was the man who took her. Her name was Linda Ann O'Keefe. She was 11 years old. And this is the story of how a little girl's DNA, preserved by one forward-thinking scientist decades before anyone knew what DNA even meant to a courtroom, would finally reach across almost half a century and grab her killer by the throat. But first, you need to understand what was lost. It was Friday, July 6th, 1973. Newport Beach was the kind of town people moved to, not away from. Sun-bleached sidewalks, the smell of salt in the air, kids on bikes until the streetlights came on. Linda O'Keefe lived in that world. She was the middle child in a family of 5, the kind of girl who had a special bond with her father, a machinist named Richard, the kind of daughter who probably rolled her eyes at her mother and adored her anyway. That morning, she left for summer school at Lincoln Intermediate in Corona Del Mar, just like any other day. Ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of day nobody thinks to memorize until it becomes the last one. Classes ended, and Linda started walking home. She never arrived. Somewhere along that route, somewhere between the schoolyard and her front door, 11-year-old Linda O'Keefe vanished. Just gone, no scream anyone remembered, no struggle anyone witnessed. A handful of people would later recall a suspicious man near a van in the area that afternoon. But in 1973, a van was just a van. Nobody connected it to anything. Not yet. Her parents did what parents do when the sun goes down and a child isn't home. They waited by the phone. They called neighbors. They told themselves there was an explanation, a friend's house, a lost sense of time, something innocent. There wasn't. The next morning, in a ditch near a nature trail in an area known as the Back Bay, someone found her. She had been strangled. I won't describe what else was done to her, because Linda O'Keefe deserves to be remembered as a girl who loved her father, not as a crime scene. But I will tell you this, whoever did this to her did not do it quickly. And whoever did this to her had done this kind of thing before, or would do it again. The town of Corona Del Mar shattered that week. This was supposed to be the safe place, the postcard place. And now there was a killer walking among sunbathers and station wagons, and nobody knew his face. Homicide detectives worked the case hard in those first months. They interviewed witnesses. They chased down the van. They came up empty. Weeks became months. Months became years. And Linda O'Keefe's file slid, inch by inch, toward the back of a filing cabinet, the way cold cases do, not because anyone stopped caring, but because leads simply ran out. Here's the question I want you to sit with for a moment. What kind of man can kill a child in the middle of the day, in a town full of witnesses, and simply walk away? Not flee the state, not change his name, just melt back into the ordinary rhythm of life, as if nothing happened at all. Because that's exactly what he did for 46 years. He went to work. He may have had neighbors who waved to him in the morning. He may have had a family of his own. And every single one of those years, Linda O'Keefe's photograph stayed on a wall in a police station, waiting. There was one detail though, one decision made in a lab back in 1973 that nobody could have known would matter someday. A careful criminalist collected evidence from Linda's body and preserved it. Just in case science ever caught up, it would take decades. It would take a revolution in forensic technology nobody could have predicted. It would take a police department willing to try something no one had tried before, giving a murdered 11-year-old girl a voice on social media decades after her death to reach the one person who might still remember something. And eventually, it would take a single spit of DNA entered into a national database to bring a name out of the shadows. The shadows. But that name wouldn't surface for a long, long time. And when it finally did, it would shock the very detectives who found it. By the mid-1970s, the case of Linda O'Keefe had gone cold in the way most cases go cold, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow, quiet exhaustion. Every lead investigated, every alibi checked, every known offender in the area questioned and cleared. And still nothing. But here's what made this case different from so many others that fade into forgotten boxes. Newport Beach Police Department refused to let it die. Detectives rotated through the years. Retired, new ones took their place, and each new generation inherited the same box of evidence, the same grainy photographs, the same haunting, unanswered question. Who did this to Linda? That preserved evidence from her body sat frozen in time, waiting for forensic science to catch up to the crime. And through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, DNA technology was crawling toward a future nobody in 1973 could have imagined. By 2001, technology had finally advanced enough to generate a genetic profile of an unknown male suspect from the evidence collected decades earlier. Investigators ran it through CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. No match. Whoever this man was, he had never been arrested for anything serious enough to land his DNA in the system. He was, as far as the justice system was concerned, a ghost. Think about that for a moment. A DNA profile existed. Detectives had, in a very real sense, already caught him. They just didn't know his name, his face, or where he lived. It's one of the strangest positions in criminal investigation. You possess the truth. You're holding it in a test tube, and it tells you nothing you can act on. So the case went quiet again. Another decade slipped by. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you were that man, if you knew somewhere in the back of your mind that a piece of yourself was locked in an evidence room, waiting, could you ever really sleep at night? Or does the human mind simply learn to bury things so deep that even guilt goes silent? Because whoever he was, he showed no signs of unraveling. He didn't confess. He didn't flee. He lived. In October 2017, Newport Beach Sergeant Court Depfeg tried something new. He sent the unidentified DNA profile to a company called Parabon Nanolabs, a lab pioneering a technique called DNA phenotyping, essentially, predicting what a person might physically look like based purely on their genetic markers. Eye color, hair color, skin tone, facial structure, estimated through algorithms and probability. The result was a composite, not a photograph, an educated scientific guess at a face nobody had seen since 1973, rendered from nothing but molecules. It wasn't enough on its own, but it was a start. Then, in 2018, on the 45th anniversary of Linda's disappearance, the department did something no one expected. Sergeant Depweg and police spokeswoman Jennifer Manzella decided to give Linda her voice back. They built a social media campaign, a series of tweets told from Linda's own point of view, walking the public through her final day. Her morning. Her walk to school. The small, ordinary details of a life that was about to be stolen. It worked exactly as they hoped. The story spread. News outlets picked it up. Thousands of people who had never heard of Linda O'Keefe suddenly knew her name, and knew that composite face generated from a killer's own DNA. Tips poured in. Investigators chased every one of them. Still, no arrest. The composite sketch had done its job, stirring public memory, but it wasn't precise enough to point directly at one man among millions. What Newport Beach detectives needed wasn't just a face, they needed a family tree. And by 2018, a new investigative technique was quietly transforming cold case work across the country. It was called Investigative Genetic Genealogy. Instead of searching for a direct match to a known criminal, detectives could now upload a crime scene DNA profile to public genealogy databases, the same kind of sites ordinary people use to find long-lost cousins, and search for partial matches. Second cousins. Third cousins. Distant relatives who had no idea their own curiosity about ancestry was about to hand police a killer. It had already cracked open some of the most notorious cold cases in American history. Newport Beach detectives decided it was time to try it on Linda's case. What they didn't know yet was just how close the answer had been, all along. Not hiding in some far-off state, not some drifter passing through town for one violent afternoon in 1973. He had a name, he had relatives, and somewhere, buried in a family tree nobody had thought to examine, his branch was about to be exposed. Genetic genealogy works almost like solving a puzzle with only the edge pieces. Investigators uploaded the killer's DNA profile to public ancestry databases and began searching for anyone who shared enough genetic markers to be a relative. Not a match. A relative. A second cousin. A great uncle. Someone connected by blood who had no idea they were about to become the thread that unraveled a 46-year-old murder. Slowly, a family tree began to take shape on a detective's screen. Branches spreading outward, names, birth dates, marriages, migrations across state lines. It's painstaking work, part genealogy, part detective instinct, cross-referencing ages, locations, and criminal history against everything investigators already knew about the case. And somewhere in that sprawling tree, one name started to fit disturbingly well. James Allen Neal. Born around the same era as their unidentified suspect. Living in the region in 1973. A man who had drifted through Riverside, Hemet, and Winchester, California, before eventually settling in Colorado. On paper, an unremarkable life. No violent criminal record that had ever landed him in a database. No headlines. No warnings. Detectives quietly built their case. They needed a direct DNA sample from Neal himself, something they could compare, cell for cell, against the evidence preserved from Linda's body decades earlier. So investigators did what cold case detectives often do in this final delicate stage. They watched, and they waited for him to discard something. A cup. A cigarette. Something ordinary that a man throws away without a second thought, never imagining it holds the answer to who he really is. Here's the question worth pausing on. If genetic genealogy hadn't existed, if millions of ordinary people hadn't voluntarily mailed their spit to ancestry companies out of nothing more than curiosity about where their families came from, would James Allen Neal still be a free man today? How many other killers are living quiet, unremarkable lives right now, protected by nothing more than the absence of a database? It's a strange thought. The very human desire to know where we came from may end up being the thing that finally reveals who among us has always been hiding a monster. The DNA sample from that discarded item was sent to the lab, and when the results came back, there was no ambiguity, no room for reasonable doubt. It was a match. The DNA collected from Linda O'Keefe's body in July of 1973 belonged to James Allen Neal. On February 20th, 2019, at a joint press conference, the Orange County District Attorney's Office and Newport Beach Police Department announced what generations of detectives had worked toward without ever seeing it happen in their own lifetimes. James Allen Neal, 72 years old, had been arrested in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and charged with the murder of 11-year-old Linda Ann O'Keefe. Newport Beach Police Chief John Lewis stood before the cameras and spoke words that had waited 46 years to be said. The pursuit of justice, prosecutors said, had lasted more than 4 decades and outlived the careers of investigator after investigator who had refused to let Linda's case disappear. But the story didn't end with just one victim. As investigators dug deeper into Neal's life following his arrest, they uncovered something that turned a single tragedy into a pattern. Neal was also charged with sexually assaulting 2 children in Riverside County, assaults that had occurred not in 1973, but decades later, in the 1990s and early 2000s. Sit with that for a moment. This was not a man who committed one unspeakable act in his youth and somehow mysteriously stopped. This was a man who appeared to have continued targeting children across an entire lifetime, moving through different counties, different decades, always slipping just far enough beneath the radar to avoid the kind of arrest that would land his Dina in a system built to catch him. Linda O'Keefe's case wasn't an isolated horror. It may have been the first thread in a much longer, much darker pattern that stretched across nearly 50 years. Neil was extradited to California to face justice. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, the murder of Linda O'Keefe and the assaults in Riverside County. A trial was set in motion. For the first time since 1973, there was a real possibility that a courtroom, not just a cold case file, would finally hear Linda's name spoken alongside the word justice. Her family, who had waited nearly half a century for this moment, prepared themselves for something they likely never expected to see in their lifetimes. But justice, as it so often does in cases this old, had one more cruel twist waiting. James Allen Neal never stood trial. On May 27, 2020, while still awaiting his day in court, Neal fell ill in custody. He was taken to a hospital on May 25th with an undisclosed illness. 2 days later, he was pronounced dead. He was 73 years old. No trial. No verdict read aloud in a courtroom. No moment where a jury looked James Allen Neal in the eye and said the word guilty. The man accused of murdering Linda O'Keefe and of assaulting 2 more children decades later died before the justice system could finish what it started. For a family that had waited 47 years, this was its own kind of gut punch. They had lived through the unbearable weight of an unsolved case. They had lived through the strange, aching hope of a genetic breakthrough. They had lived through an arrest that finally gave them a name, a face, an answer to the question that had haunted them since 1973. And then, just as the machinery of justice began to turn, it stopped again, not because the case failed, but because the man responsible simply ran out of time before he could be made to answer for it in open court. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer spoke to that exact tension. The pursuit of justice, he said, is never truly finished, even when the man who committed the crime is gone. It had taken more than 4 decades, and it had outlasted entire careers of investigators who worked the case and retired without ever seeing an arrest. Newport Beach Police Chief John Lewis put it simply. It had been the department's intention to see James Allen Neal stand trial and answer in front of a judge and jury for what he did to Linda Ann O'Keefe. That never happened. But he said something else, too, that Linda's story had deeply touched their community, and that through the tireless work of generations of investigators, they hoped they had still managed to bring some measure of closure to her family, her friends, and everyone who loved her. Is that enough? Can a Dina match in an arrest, without a trial, without a verdict, ever really close a wound like this one? There's no clean answer. Some families say knowing is everything, that living without a name attached to their grief is its own prison. And finally having won, even without a courtroom conviction, lets them breathe for the first time in decades. Others say that nothing short of watching a person face judgment, in public, under oath, can ever feel like justice. What we do know is this. Linda O'Keefe was 11 years old. She loved her father. She was the middle child in a family of 5. She walked home from summer school on an ordinary Friday afternoon in July, and she never came home. For 46 years, her photograph hung on the wall of a police department that refused to let her be forgotten. Detective after detective inherited her file, inherited her unanswered question, and passed it down the line rather than letting it die in a drawer. It took the invention of an entirely new field of forensic science, investigative genetic genealogy, born from millions of strangers simply curious about their own family trees, to finally reach across generations and pull a killer's name out of the dark. And it's worth remembering that Linda's case became more than just her own story. It became a warning about how long a predator can hide inside an ordinary life, how many decades can pass, how many other children can be hurt, before technology and persistence finally catch up to him. Newport Beach police still keep her memory alive. The Twitter campaign that gave Linda her voice back in 2018, the composite sketch built from nothing but molecules. The case file that never once got buried for good, all of it stands as a quiet promise to every other family still waiting on an answer somewhere out there. That cold does not have to mean forgotten. That decades later, a piece of evidence preserved by one careful scientist in 1973 can still, eventually, speak the truth. Linda Ann O'Keefe was taken from her family and her future on a summer afternoon in Newport Beach. She never got to grow up. She never got to become whoever she might have been. But her name is remembered. Her story is told. And the man who took everything from her was finally, unmistakably, identified, even if a courtroom never got the chance to say it out loud. Sometimes that has to be enough. Sometimes it never quite is. Either way, Linda O'Keefe is not forgotten